gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and honor being here back again. I was speaking at this podium 2 years ago. I visited Chile for the last 20 years many times. It's a great country with great people, great culture, great economy. It's always a great honor to be here, to always present my views, but also to learn a lot about this country. I'm very honored that Banco BICE invited me again to be in front of these distinguished senior members of the bank, to be here in front of you, business, financial, and intellectual leaders of your country, and a great honor also to be again with my good friend Sebastian Edwards. I remember when I was in graduate school at Harvard University in the early 80s, Sebastian was already one of the leading scholars in the field of international macro, international finance, and a leading expert on Latin American economies, and a lot of what I learned in grad school on Latin America, but also important theoretical and empirical work in international economics came from him. And it's not just him, there's been a whole generation of Chileans who had studied and gotten degrees and have become great scholars, and also some of them become also leading policymakers in your country. I had the honor again this morning to meet Felipe Loren, your finance minister. We overlapped at Harvard during graduate school. We had the same advisor. I was a colleague at New York University with your former finance minister, Andres Velasco, who was also a leading economist before he became a policymaker. And over the years, I've interacted with other leading scholars and then policymakers like Jose de Gregorio and many other ones. So it's always an honor and pleasure and intellectual stimulation coming here. And I think that today, Sebastian gave us an excellent masterclass about Chile. Chile is a great country, has done very well in the last 20, 30 years with market-oriented reform, has had 6% economic growth in the last 2 years. But what Sebastian told us is the ambition of doing more. You don't want to be only a middle-income country, but you have the potential of becoming one of the highest income countries in the world with the right types of structural reform. And this push and ambition to do better and do more is what unites business leaders, financial leaders, intellectual leaders, and scholars of this country. So it's always this energy that I find here that I find it very, very interesting and important. So it's a pleasure to be back here and to give you a little of my perspective about what's going on in the global economy and how it may affect also, of course, Latin America and Chile. And the way I describe the global economy is it's a mixed bag. It's a glass that is half full, is half empty. There are some positive trends and some upside risks to the global economy, and there are plenty of downside risks, vulnerabilities of things that go wrong. And I think that a fair assessment and objective assessment would address both the positive factors and some of the risks that may affect then the global economy as well. So I'm going to start with what is going well in the global economy today, and then address some of the risks that we're facing both globally in the region and then in Chile. The first positive about the global economy is that after the most severe economic and financial crisis since the Great Depression, there has been a global economic recovery, and not just a recovery of economies, but recovery of stock markets and financial markets since 2009. Now, this economic recovery has been weaker, more anemic in advanced economies because of the burden of too much private and public debt, has been much more robust and dynamic in emerging market economies, but there is an economic recovery. Today, the IMF has upgraded its global economic outlook for this year to 3.5% for the global economy. Stronger emerging markets, weaker advanced economies, and they predict that the global economy might be stronger even next year. So that's a positive, and with that economic recovery, there's been a strong recovery of financial markets, of equity markets, both in advanced economies and emerging markets. And the second positive about the global economy is something that is not just cyclical, but is a more secular phenomenon, is the rise of the economic, trading, and financial power of emerging market economies. Advanced economies, even if they grow at potential, the potential growth rate in Europe and Japan is maybe 1.5% to 2%, maybe in the US 2.5%, but the average potential growth rate for an emerging market is closer to 6%. by distribution. Some countries might grow faster than 6%, some countries lower, but the average growth rate for the last decade or so has been 6%. And that implies that even if every country in the world was growing at its own potential, a larger share of global GDP and a larger share of global growth in the next few years is going to be accounted by emerging market economies. And when we talk about this emerging market, it's not just a story about China or India or about emerging Asia. Certainly emerging Asia among emerging market regions is the one that's growing fastest, but there is lots of good things happening, for example, in many parts of Latin America. Not everywhere in Latin America, but lots of positive things occurring in terms of economic reforms that are in the right direction, from Chile to Brazil, to Colombia, to Uruguay, to Peru, and other countries in the region. There's lots of positive things that's happening in some parts of Central Europe, even in Central Asia. Even in the Middle East, where the headlines for the last few years, of course, have been about the Arab Spring and the political and geopolitical turmoil, let's not forget there's a huge amount of wealth, oil and energy wealth in the Gulf that can be used productively to increase growth in the Gulf and throughout the Middle East. And even in Sub-Saharan Africa, that for a long time was trapped in a trap of poverty, of diseases, of civil war, of underdevelopment, there are positive things happening. From East Africa, in places like Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, to West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, to Southern Africa, Mozambique, Botswana, Angola, South Africa. So this is going to be a completely different world, one in which the share of global growth coming from emerging markets is going to increase. And with increased economic, financial, and trading power, there is also an increase of political and geopolitical power. That's why the G7 and the G8, it was the club of advanced economies, of industrial economies, became obsolete, and now the new leading body, that is the Economic International Governance Body, is not anymore the G7 but the G20, where half of the country are emerging markets and the other half of the country are advanced economies. And it's a good news that this year Mexico invited Chile to be a member of the G20 this year. In my view, Chile as a country would deserve to be a permanent member of G20. In many ways, it's a model of how doing things right, not just for emerging markets, not just for Latin America, but many places in the world, including Europe, could learn a few things about stable macroeconomic, financial, and development from a country like Chile. So it's a brave new world, and the world is going to be run by the G20. So that's a kind of shift that is important. And the good thing about the emerging market is that they are urbanizing, they are industrializing, there is population growth, there is per capita income growth, there is a rise of the middle class, there is economic and political stability, and that's going to be a more balanced world, a world in which the poles of growth, the engines and locomotives of growth are not going to be just US, Europe, Japan as they were, but also Latin America, also Asia, also many other emerging markets. That's a positive in the medium and long run. Third positive about the global economy is that if you look at the balance sheets of different sectors of advanced economies, there is fragility, of course, for households that have too much debt, for state and local governments and central governments that have too much debt and deficits, for some banks and financial institutions in US and Europe that are still fragile. But if there is one sector of the economy that is strong, efficient, productive, profitable, where earnings and profitability have surprised quarter after quarter on the upside, these are the high-grade corporates, private companies in the US, in Europe, in Japan, and of course, in emerging market economy. These companies, even in emerging markets now, are becoming much more international. Now we have multinational corporations in emerging markets, not only in advanced economies. And the balance sheets and the P&L of these high-grade corporates are strong and very profitable, and these corporates are sitting today on trillions of dollars of cash. And if they become more confident about the global economic recovery, they do have the financial resources to do more job hiring, more capital spending, more M&A activity, more foreign direct investment, more financial transactions. So the fact that corporates in the private sector are sound both in advanced economies and emerging markets can be a source of significant greater economic growth in the next few years. Fourth positive thing about the global economy is that the process of globalization, in spite of some backlash against it, is still ongoing. There is greater international trade in goods. There is greater international trade in services. Services used to be non-tradable, but now because of the new information technologies, even services are tradable. There is more international movement of capital, financial capital, real capital, in the form of foreign direct investment. There is more international migration of labor. There is more international trade in technology, information, in idea, in news. And a lot of that is important because that's going to lead to increasing productivity growth. Countries in the last 50, 60 years have succeeded in the global economy are countries that opened up to trade, to financial flows, to integration in the global economy. Countries that have remained behind are those that remained actually closed rather than opening up. And the story of Chile and many other small open economies suggests that however small as a country you can be, if you open up yourself to the global economy, your market is not just your small domestic market, but this entire global market of 180 countries, billions of people, and therefore you can succeed if you're a small open economy, whether you're in Chile, or in Israel, or in Korea, or in Hong Kong, or in Singapore, or many other success stories in the global economy. Of course, with globalization, there are some side consequences. Sometimes there are winners and losers within countries and across countries. Sometimes globalization has been associated for a while with an increase in income and wealth inequality. There are trends of a backlash against globalization, tendencies of protectionism and so on. And that implies that we have to make sure, as I'll discuss later, that economic growth is inclusive. It doesn't lead to a widening of inequality, to make sure that there is not a backlash against globalization. But globalization is a positive force that's going to be beneficial for increasing productivity and growth over the long run. The fifth positive trend in the global economy is that there are many sectors, both traditional and new ones, that are going to be sources of technological innovation, of demands for goods and services in the medium-long run. With the rise of the middle class in emerging markets, there will be greater demand for a whole variety of goods, but also of services. In many emerging markets, there is a huge need for infrastructure, and infrastructure spending is going to be important for long-term economic growth. There are many new industries of the future. We don't know whether the sources of greater innovation is going to be in what people refer as ET, energy technologies, both variants of traditional fossil fuels like shale gas, fracking, oil sands, and you name it, or whether it's going to be alternative energy, green economy, and renewable resources. But whether it's the traditional or the new one, there is lots of interesting stuff is happening in energy technologies. There is a new development in what people refer as BT, biotech, stem cell research, gene therapy, developments in biomedical research, nanotechnologies, and that's going to change how we provide, for example, healthcare services. Maybe most of the innovation are going to happen in what people refer as IT, information technologies, Web 2.0, Web 3.0, social media, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, robotic, integration of traditional media and telecom with online one. There's lots of creative stuff is happening. So we know that in the long run, the main determinants of economic success is productivity growth. Productivity growth depends on good institution, investing in human capital, investing in physical capital, investing in infrastructure, and investing into the new goods and services of the future that imply investment in research and development and new technology. Lots of stuff is happening, and the good news is that this technological innovation today are not occurring only as traditionally in advanced economies, but a number of them are occurring also in emerging markets, from China to India to Brazil to other parts of the world. So investing into that is going to be important. So these are the positives about the global economy. We should recognize them, that are going to be important driver of economic growth, both in the short run and some of these factors in the medium and long term. Let me now talk about what are the downside risks, about the things that could go wrong in the global economy, things that we should be worrying about, and try to figure out then the balance between the two.
Some of these factors, of course, are going to be relevant and important for Latin America and in Chile. The first observation I'll make is the following one. The recovery in most advanced economies since the end of the global financial crisis has been anemic, subpar, below trend, more like a U-shaped recovery rather than the typical V-shaped recovery that occurs after a typical recession. And the reason why the recovery in the US, in Europe, in UK, in Japan has been anemic is that this was not a typical recession, but was a recession caused by financial crisis, and the financial crisis caused initially by too much debt and leverage in the private sector, households, financial institutions, some corporates, and because of the response of the crisis, massive fiscal stimulus, there's been now a massive increase in budget deficits and in public debt. So we are now in a situation in which in advanced economies there is too much debt both in the private and public sector. In economic history, research done by many academics, research done by the IMF and others, suggests that every time you come out of a financial crisis with a balance sheet recession, with too much debt in the private and public sector, there's a painful period of slow economic growth because there's a painful process of deleveraging. You have to spend less in the private and public sector, you have to save more or save less in order to gradually reduce this debt and leverage. And that implies that unfortunately economic growth is going to be weaker. Now the good news is of course that the recovery in most emerging market economies, with some exception, has been a V-shaped recovery after the financial crisis. And the reason why the recovery in emerging markets has been more robust are several. First of all, potential growth in emerging markets, as I pointed out, is higher than advanced economies. Two, most of these emerging markets did not have the same balance sheet problems, too much private and public debt that advanced economies have today. Many of these emerging markets had their own financial crisis caused by excess 10, 15 years ago. They learned their lessons, they cleaned up their banks, they cleaned up their balance sheets, they cleaned up their macro policy, fiscal, monetary, and so on, and now they're much more resilient because they're sound macro policies, fiscal, monetary, commitment to low inflation, lower budget deficits, lower stocks of public debt, sound, well-capitalized, liquid banks and financial system, and therefore they don't suffer of the problem of deleveraging that advanced economies do. And the other reason why emerging markets are in better shape is because of their sounder macro, they have more room for policy response. If there is a slowdown, they can cut interest rates, they can do fiscal stimulus, they can use the exchange rate as a tool for adjusting to external shocks. So emerging markets are doing well, but that painful process of deleveraging in advanced economies is going to take several more years. And unfortunately, if economic growth in advanced economies is going to be weak for a number of years, there is not going to be a full decoupling of emerging markets from the weakness of advanced economies. We're in a global economy where no country is an island because of trade links, financial links, currency links, commodity links, confidence links, equity market links. When there is a shock in advanced economies, it affects emerging markets. So the shocks last year in the Eurozone affected financial conditions in Latin America to a certain degree. So unfortunately, if you're integrated in the global economy, in good times things go well, but in bad times there are shocks that affect you as well. So first concern is that in most advanced economies the process of deleveraging is still ongoing. Second concern is the problems of the periphery of the Eurozone. That group of countries, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain, in which not only there is not economic growth, but there is actually today a recession. The US might not be growing very fast, but is growing 2% plus. But right now, there is an ongoing recession in the periphery of the Eurozone, and the problems of the Eurozones are twofold. There is a stock problem, large stocks of public debt in many countries, and large stock of private debts of the corporates, of the banks in some of these countries in the periphery. So there is a stock problem, and some of these stocks of debt may be unsustainable, like in the case of Greece. But there is also in the periphery of the Eurozone a flow problem, lack of economic growth and outright recession, lack and loss of external competitiveness, because in the last 10 years, unit labor costs rose more than 40%, and their currency appreciated in real terms, and now there are large trade and current account deficits that the private market doesn't want to finance. And unfortunately, not only there is a recession in the peripheral Eurozone, but for the time being, I fear that this recession is not going to bottom out. It's going to become worse. And it's going to become worse for a number of reasons. The first one is that while fiscal austerity is necessary, because if you don't do the fiscal austerity, eventually, like in Greece, you're going to have a debt crisis. In the short run, raising taxes, cutting government spending, reducing transfer payments makes the recession worse, because on one side you're reducing aggregate demand, on the other side with the raise of taxes, you're reducing disposable income. So unfortunately, you're in a situation in which then if you do, then if you don't. If you don't do the fiscal adjustment, you'll have a fiscal train wreck and a debt crisis. If you do it, the fiscal drag may make the recession worse, at least for a while. That's one problem. The second problem is that while Germany, that is very competitive, uber competitive, can live with a euro at 1.3, with the US dollar, could be even 1.4 or 1.5, Germany is going to do fine. For the periphery of the Eurozone, where unit labor costs rose 40% in the last decade, the value of the euro should be falling 20 or 30% relative to the US dollar to restore the external competitiveness and external balance of the country. And for many reasons, the euro is not weakening. It's still stuck around 1.3. Third problem with the Eurozone is that in the periphery of the Eurozone, there is a credit crunch, because banks now have liquidity with the action of the ECB. They don't have capital. They have to raise capital to a 9% capital ratio. The way they're going to do it is going to be by deleveraging, credit contraction, selling assets. They may make the credit crunch worse. Fourth problem of the Eurozone is that high oil prices hurt economic growth in the Eurozone. In the US, at least, half of our domestic consumption comes from domestic production. In the Eurozone, almost of all demand comes from imports. There is not much domestic production of oil. And the final factor that is weakening the Eurozone is there is mounting political fragility in the Eurozone. In Greece, there are going to be elections where the parties who want default and exit today may get 40–50% of the vote. In France, you have a candidate that, if elected, says is against the fiscal compact and he wants to raise income taxes to the rich to 75%. In Ireland, you have a referendum on the fiscal austerity, it might go wrong. And even in Spain, where the recession is becoming worse, now there is fatigue against the economic reform, against the fiscal austerity. More strikes, more demonstration. And the trouble with lack of economic growth is the following one. If output keeps on falling, eventually you're going to have two problems of Europe. The first is economic financial. You are trying to stabilize your debt and deficits as a share of GDP, but if the denominator GDP keeps on falling, your debt and deficits are going to go higher and higher, even if you are trying to reduce your deficits. So you look unsustainable. And secondly, if there is no light at the end of the tunnel with a recovery of jobs, of growth, of income, people want to sacrifices in the short run. They accept it for another year, but if you're going to have another 2 or 3 years of ongoing recession, unemployment, eventually the social and political backlash against that recession, strikes, demonstration, riots, governments that are weak falling again could become overwhelming, and therefore the reforms are not going to occur. And the problem of Europe today is that there is not a strategy for growth, there is strategy for fiscal austerity. Now, it's a slow motion train wreck, but we have to worry about what's happening still in the Eurozone. The risks maybe are not as severe as 4 months ago when Italy and Spain looked like on the verge of collapsing, but there is fragility, as we've seen in the last few weeks, with the interest rates on the debt of Spain and Italy going up again. So that remains a worry about the global economy. Third worry about the global economy is the situation in the Middle East with the conflict potentially between Israel and the US on one side and Iran on the other side on the question of nuclear nuclear proliferation and the effect that has done on the price of oil. Oil prices, Brent, last year was $90 a barrel. Today, in the last few weeks, has been between 120 and 125. The balance of fundamental supply and demand has not changed significantly last year or so. What has happened is there is a fear premium. That fear premium comes from the risk that eventually this tension between the two sides are going to lead to an outright military confrontation. Now, I'm not an expert of geopolitics. I was recently in Washington. I spoke with people in the White House, in Treasury, in defense, in intelligence sources, Israeli. Some people say, for sure, we're going to have a war in the next 6 months to a year. Some people say, we're not going to have a war. But even without an actual military confrontation, right now there is a war of words between the two sides. There is a covert war between the two sides. These negotiations are ongoing right now, may fail. If they fail, sanctions are going to be exacerbated. The covert war is going to increase. Oil prices will become even higher. And of course, high rising oil prices is bad news for the US, for Europe, for Japan, for China, for India, for Chile, and for all the advanced economies and emerging markets that make oil and energy important. That's a risk. And leaving aside the issue of Israel-Iran, the Middle East is a very fragile kind of region. Think of it, we had the Arab Spring starting in Tunisia, then Egypt, then Libya. Each one of these countries is extremely unstable, economically, fiscally, financially. They could have a crisis, let alone politically. We have civil war in Syria. We have a civil war in Yemen. We have restless Shiite minorities in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait. Even Jordan could be fragile, where 2/3 of the population is Palestinian. You could have tensions rising between Turkey and Iran, Turkey and Syria, between Turkey and Israel. There is still tension between Israel and Palestinians. Now that the US has left Iraq, the three sides, Kurds, Shiite, Sunnite, are starting to kill each other again, let alone going to the farther Middle East, what's going on right now in Afghanistan or in Pakistan. The point being, historically, the Middle East has been a source of geopolitical tensions that have led then to spikes in oil prices. Unfortunately, the transition to democracy in the Middle East is not going to be smooth. It's going to be a transition with economic, financial, political, fiscal instability. And therefore, the Middle East can be, beyond the Israel-Iran question, a source of instability for the global economy. Fourth thing that I kind of worry about. I believe in the emerging market story. I believe in the BRICS story. I believe that China has been very successful for the last decade or decades. But my worry is that there has been too much hype about the BRICS country, about Brazil, Russia, India, and China. All of these countries could grow very fast, but all of them are not accelerating the kind of structural, market-oriented reform that are going to increase potential growth. So China was growing 10%, last year was 9%, this year is going to be 7.5%. If they don't do certain reform, they're going to switch demand to consumption, China down the line, as I discussed, could have a hard landing. Potential growth in Russia is barely 3.5%, as is an economy based on oil, energy, and little else. Even a country like Brazil is moving away from doing market-oriented reform. There are variants of state capitalism, like in China and Russia, that are starting to be implemented even in Brazil. Potential growth rate of Brazil might not be more than 4%. And for a country with this much poverty, 4% is not good enough. South Africa, potential growth of 3.5%. In India, growth was for 2 years 9%, now it's slowing down to 6% as the coalition politics of India is stalling any structural reforms. Now, the kind of structural reforms that are needed in these emerging markets are different, in each country different. China has too much infrastructure spending, not much private consumption. India and Brazil have plenty of consumption, but not enough investment in infrastructure spending. But the kind of reforms are different, but all of these countries have to accelerate market-oriented reform, and unfortunately, a number of them are drifting away from this market-oriented reform. If anything, they're moving towards variants of state capitalism, of state interference in the private sector, using national champions, having government intervention in the economy that becomes excessive, and things that are not going to be conducive of higher potential growth over the long run. And in the case of China specifically, the biggest China challenge is the following one. The traditional model of growth of China has been export-led growth with a weak currency. In recent years, massive amount of fixed investment, real estate, infrastructure, industrial manufacturing capacity, high saving rates, and low consumption. Today, in China, fixed investment is 50% of GDP, between infrastructure, real estate, industrial manufacturing capacity. No country in the world can be so productive. You take every year half of your GDP, you reinvest into new capital stock, and you're not going to have misallocation of resources, rising non-performing loans in your banking system, an investment bust, and a rise in debts of state and local governments, and so on. So the biggest challenge for China over the next few years is going to be to do the structural reform. They're going to reduce savings, they're going to reduce net exports, they're going to reduce fixed investment, and they're going to increase consumption as a share of GDP. I do worry that those reforms in China are going to occur too slowly compared to what's optimal and desirable, and therefore not this year, not next year, but if those reforms are not implemented in the next 2 or 3 years, you could have a significant slowdown of growth in China when the investment boom goes into bust, when consumption doesn't grow fast enough. You could even have a hard landing in China in the next few years. It's not a short-term risk, but something that you have to worry. My final point is about the United States. Compared to the United Kingdom, compared to the Eurozone, compared to Japan, US is doing better. We've had at least 2% plus or minus growth in the last few quarters. However, I read the US economic data as being more mixed. For the last few years, the optimists have been saying US soon is going to go back to high economic growth, 3% plus. Every year, growth has been below trend. Has been disappointing. And it's been disappointing because the painful process of deleveraging is still ongoing in the United States. If anything, the US has postponed the fiscal austerity. Europe has front-loaded the fiscal austerity, that's why there is slower growth. The US has decided to kick the can down the road. Nothing is done about our structural budget deficit. But by next year, whether President Obama is re-elected or whether a Republican is going to win the presidency, it looks like the Republican candidate is going to be Mitt Romney, there will be a fiscal drag, there will be a fiscal cliff, because there are automatic spending cuts, because most of the tax cuts of the last decade on payroll, on dividends, on income, on capital gains are going to expire. Not all of them are going to be maintained, and therefore some reduction in spending, some gradual increase in taxes, some reduction in transfer payments is going to imply a fiscal drag from the public sector. And the only reason why consumption growth in the US has been okay has not been because real wages are growing. Real wages actually in the US are falling. What has sustained disposable income for the US household has been reduction of taxes and increase in transfer payments that have been paid with another $1 trillion of additional public debt. So we have prevented the deleveraging of the households by even more releveraging of the public sector. And therefore, by next year, when some of the deleveraging of the government will have to occur, regardless of who's elected, that's going to force also another round of deleveraging of the private sector. So I don't yet see the self-sustaining, robust recovery of the US being around the corner. We still have 2 or 3 years on painful deleveraging that is going to be ongoing. Now, if you look at these downside risks, what do they imply for Latin America? What do they imply for Chile? All of them, of course, if they were to materialize, and you have to assign probability, there would be negatives. If the Eurozone turmoil will become worsened, financial strains in stock market, in credit markets will become worse. And as you remember, last year between the summer and the fall, the rising pensions in the Eurozone led to a contraction of liquidity that was going from advanced economies to emerging markets, with a tightening of credit conditions, even in sound financial systems like the one of Chile, of those in Latin America. So if Eurozone gets worse, it's bad to trade and financial channels. Secondly, if the price of oil were to rise further, that's going to be a negative for all importing countries, including those in Latin America that are oil importing, like Chile and others. Of course, in the short run, that rise in oil prices is beneficial for a country like Brazil that is a net oil exporter, but if oil prices become so high that they destroy income and demand in advanced economies and emerging markets, like 2008 when oil prices went to $145 a barrel, and that was a tipping point for the global economy, eventually that's destructive of income and demand. So the Middle East, unfortunately, is a source of risk for oil and energy importing. Third of all, as I pointed out, if China were to slow down more than people expect, that's going to be a negative for China, for emerging Asia, for commodity exporters, both in Asia, Latin America, and around the world, and China being the second largest economy in the world, it will be negative, of course, for the global economy. Finally, Latin America still significantly depends on trade with the United States. As I said, in relative terms, the US looks better than Europe or Japan, but there's a risk that actually, instead of accelerating growth in the US, if we postpone the necessary reforms, growth might not accelerate in the US, might actually slow down further. Weakening of economic growth in the US would be a negative for Latin America and for Chile. Now, different people, of course, assign different probabilities to the risk of the Eurozone, to the risk of the Middle Eastern oil, to the risk of Yemen, China, or the United States. And we live in a world in which, of course, there is uncertainty, there is volatility. We don't know. Things could surprise on the upside, things could surprise on the downside. What are the final lessons, however? The final lesson I think that's important is that if you are a small open economy in the world, the best thing you can do is to be dynamic, to be flexible, to be open to the global economy, and to create a macro environment that is sound, so that even if shock occur from the rest of the world, you're going to be resilient. And you have to invest in things that are going to increase your potential of actual growth in the long run. And that means investing, as I pointed out, in human capital. We cannot overemphasize the role of skills, education, human capital in the global long-term economic growth. I'll give you an example. There are some countries in the world that were very poor and had absolutely zero natural resources, that imported for the last 60 years all of their resources. Countries like Korea, countries like Japan, countries like Hong Kong or Singapore or Israel. All of them from poor levels of per capita income now are high-income countries. How did they do it without any natural resources? Because they invested in good institutions, in good macro framework, and invest in their own people, into human capital and skills. Because in the long run, investing in your people is going to be the most important source of long-term economic growth. And that's relevant for Latin America, is relevant, of course, also for Chile. So you need to be open. You have to make sure that the global economy is your market through openness to trade and investment, with good sound structural reforms that are macro-oriented. You have to invest into human capital, you have to invest into physical capital, you have to invest into private sector development, and you have to invest in the right types of infrastructure that are needed to increase the productivity of the public sector and the private sector. As I said at the beginning, in many ways, Chile is an example of many things that can go right with all the important things that have been happening in this country in the last 20 or 30 years. But as Sebastian reminded us, it's not enough. You have the ambition and you have also the ability not just to be a middle-income country and be stuck like many other countries in the world have been in a middle-income trap, but to reach the next stage. And I think to reach the next stage, the kind of economic and structural reforms that Sebastian was referring to are the necessary step to lead you to the next level. In many ways, you have been a role model for emerging markets and other countries for the last 20, 30 years. You can achieve that the next step, and I'm sure that the country, with the business leadership, the financial leadership, and intellectual and the policy leadership of this country can achieve that next step and become a role model, not just for emerging markets, but also in terms of what it has achieved for many advanced economies as well. That's why it's always a great pleasure being here to be able to present my views and to listen to what you're doing as well. And thanks very much for your attention.